Have you ever been exposed in front of your own family by someone who was never supposed to know who you really are? That question lingered in the air like a shadow, long after the words were spoken. It wasn't the kind of question you expect to hear at a family barbecue. Not from the man who had barely said a word all afternoon. But there it was, quiet and sharp, cutting through the laughter and the clinking of glasses. The day had started like any other summer gathering. The backyard was filled with the familiar scent of grilled burgers and charred corn, the sun casting warm light over the mismatched lawn chairs and scattered picnic blankets. Kids ran around chasing each other, their laughter mixing with the hum of cicadas. Relatives chatted in clusters, their voices rising and falling like waves. I tried to blend in, to keep the mood light even as I felt the weight of eyes occasionally drifting my way. Some curious, some judgmental. I was the punchline, the easy target for jokes that seemed harmless enough on the surface. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The teasing started small. Offhand remarks about my job, the way I dressed, the choices I'd made that didn't quite align with the family's expectations. I laughed along, even when the jabs stung more than I cared to admit. I wanted to believe it was just family banter, nothing serious. Yet, as the afternoon wore on, the smiles grew tighter, the glances longer, and the air thickened with unspoken tension. Then, just when I thought I could endure the rest of the day by shrinking into the background, the quietest man in the room spoke. Not the cousin who had been throwing barbs all afternoon, not the outspoken aunt who loved to stir the pot, but his father. A man who had sat silently by the edge of the circle, observing but never joining in, suddenly asked a question that stopped everything cold. "Why do you always do things the way you do?" he asked, his voice low but steady, piercing through the noise. It wasn't a question about the barbecue or the latest family gossip. It was something else entirely. Something that revealed he had seen past the jokes and the surface, straight into the cracks I had tried so hard to conceal. The room fell quiet. The playful atmosphere evaporated. And in that moment, I realized this was no longer just a barbecue. It was a reckoning. I want you to stay with me here, because what's coming is harder to face than any question tossed casually over a grill. There's a weight in silence like that. A silence that doesn't just fill the room but settles inside you, pressing against the parts you try to keep hidden. If you've ever felt the sting of being an outsider in your own home, watched or judged with a quiet suspicion no one dares say aloud, then you know how that feels. It's a slow unraveling, a fracture beneath the surface that no amount of laughter or deflection can truly cover. This isn't just a story about words spoken in a moment. It's about what those words unearth, the things we bury deep because they're too painful or too complicated to confront. What I'm about to share isn't easy to admit, and it gets darker the longer you listen. The truth doesn't always come wrapped in clarity. More often, it's tangled in confusion, fear, and the desperate need to be understood. If you've ever carried the weight of judgment from those who should know you best, if you've ever felt misunderstood or silenced inside your own family's walls, then I want you to recognize that you're not alone. And maybe, if you feel compelled, you can share a little of that with me below, quietly, without expectation. Sometimes just naming the unspoken can be the first step towards something different, even if it's just a flicker of recognition in the dark. So please don't turn away yet. What lies ahead isn't what you expect. It's a story that's less about answers and more about the fractures we try to hide. And those fractures, once uncovered, have a way of changing everything. Family gatherings came around like clockwork, each one a carefully choreographed scene where the loudest voices claimed the stage without question. The house would fill with the familiar hum of overlapping conversations, the clinking of glasses, and bursts of laughter that seemed to echo off the walls, erasing any trace of quieter moments. In these settings, the dominant characters, always the same few, held court, their stories and opinions swelling until they left little room for anyone else to speak. The rest of us, especially those who spoke softly or not at all, seemed to shrink into the background, folding ourselves into the furniture as if to become invisible. It wasn't that the quieter family members were ignored out of malice. More often, it felt like an unspoken agreement, a tacit understanding that silence was the safest place to be. Over time, I learned to read the room with a kind of practiced invisibility. When Uncle Joe launched into one of his loud, boisterous tales, I'd nod along, eyes lowered, voice tucked away. When Aunt Linda's sharp remarks cut through the air, I stayed still, careful not to draw attention. The adults, with their confident volume and quick exchanges, set the tone, and any deviation from that, any attempt to insert a softer voice, was met with a subtle, almost imperceptible closing of the circle. The tension simmered beneath the surface, normalized by repetition. Raised eyebrows were rare, and moments of discomfort passed unacknowledged, quickly replaced by another joke or a new topic to shift the focus. It was like we were all actors in a play, performing roles defined by volume and bravado, while the quieter parts remained unscripted, invisible. This dynamic wasn't a secret. It was lived and breathed day after day, year after year, until it became the family's default rhythm. For me, silence wasn't just a habit, it was survival. Speaking up often meant being talked over or dismissed, and over time, the cost of attention grew too high. I learned to become a shadow, absorbing the noise without contributing to it. There was a peculiar comfort in fading out, in existing on the periphery where conflicts couldn't reach me. The louder the voices, the smaller I became, but also, paradoxically, the safer. Yet, amid the quieting tide, there was one exception: my cousin. Unlike the rest of us, he never seemed to fall into the background. He noticed the patterns, how voices rose and fell, who dominated and who receded, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. While others retreated or got swept away, he navigated the currents with ease, stepping forward exactly when the room's attention wavered. It was as if he had a sixth sense for the unspoken rules, a way to exploit the gaps where silence lingered. Watching him, I realized that attention wasn't just given or taken. It could be claimed, seized, even manipulated. He moved through the family gatherings like a conductor, directing focus without raising his voice too much, always aware of the fragile balance between noise and quiet. Where I had learned invisibility, he had learned to wield visibility as a tool, sometimes to provoke, sometimes to charm, but always to ensure he was seen. And so, while the rest of us drifted quietly in the background, my cousin remained a constant presence at the center, a reminder that even in spaces filled with noise and unspoken tension, the dynamics of attention could be bent and shaped if you knew how to listen and when to speak. At the party, my cousin's voice cut through the hum of conversation like a scalpel. He had a knack for zeroing in on someone, always someone vulnerable enough to be an easy target, and wrapping a sharp remark in the guise of a joke. He stood confidently, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room as if waiting for his next victim to make a misstep. When someone caught his attention, he pounced, and the room leaned in, anticipating the punchline. "Hey, look who finally decided to show up," he called out toward a distant relative known for being perpetually late. The comment was casual, even familiar, but the way he said it made the person's cheeks flush under the weight of dozens of eyes. The laughter that followed was polite but unmistakably at the other person's expense. I heard him later joking about a friend's new job. "So, you're the guy who got hired just to make the coffee, huh? Must be nice to have a real title on your resume." The friend laughed, but I caught the flicker of discomfort behind his smile. The room erupted around them, everyone joining in, as if confirming a shared secret that wasn't quite funny but too ingrained to challenge. Even the way my cousin moved through the crowd was calculated. He'd sidle up to someone, lean in just enough to seem intimate, then deliver a quip with a smirk, like he was letting them in on some exclusive truth. "You've been talking about losing weight for years, and look, still a work in progress." The person laughed, the sound uneasy, like a nervous shield against the sting beneath the words. When it was my turn, I found myself laughing too. Not because the jokes were harmless or clever, but because the social rhythm demanded it. Not laughing meant stepping out of the circle, risking the awkward silence that followed his jabs. I wanted to believe it was all just fun, that no one was truly hurt, but deep down, I felt the subtle squeeze in my chest, the way his words could slice through without leaving a visible scar. This time, though, the joke wasn't random. As he glanced in my direction, a slow grin spreading across his face, I caught the shift in his tone. The room quieted, sensing the change in the air. His next words landed with a precision that unsettled me. Funny how some people hide behind quietness, pretending it's strength. Guess it's easier to be invisible than to face what's really going on inside. Huh. The laughter that followed was softer, more hesitant, but it filled the space just the same. Everyone looked at me, and I realized this wasn't just another joke tossed casually into the mix. It was a carefully aimed arrow, meant to expose something I kept locked away, a secret I hadn't intended to share with anyone. The familiar warmth of the crowd suddenly felt cold, and for the first time, I wished I could disappear completely, not just blend into the background. Her voice cut through the murmur of the room like a shard of ice. Honestly, I don't know how you stand living out here in the middle of nowhere, she said, eyes flicking to mine with a smirk that didn't reach her lips. Your little house might as well be a ghost town. It's like you're hiding from the world, or maybe just too scared to be part of it. The laughter that followed was sharp, quick, and far too easy. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, the heat of embarrassment pressing down like a weight. The room shifted instantly. The easy camaraderie that had filled the air moments before fractured. The lightness replaced by a stiff, uncomfortable tension. People exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh along or to pretend nothing had happened. The cousin's words had cracked the veneer of friendliness, exposing something raw and exposed beneath. I could see several faces stiffen, a few shifting in their seats as if wanting to escape the sudden spotlight. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice caught somewhere between disbelief and shame. The mocking tone in her voice lingered like a shadow, darkening the space between us. My fingers clenched the edge of my chair, knuckles whitening, but no one reached out to steady me. The room's warmth had drained away, replaced by a cold stillness that settled heavily on my shoulders. One of the older relatives cleared their throat awkwardly, glancing around as if searching for a way to dissolve the moment. But the silence only stretched, growing thicker with every passing second. The laughter had died too fast, leaving behind a hollow echo that seemed to amplify the sting of the comment rather than ease it. It was as if everyone had been waiting for permission to move on, but no one wanted to be the first. I caught the eye of my best friend across the room. Her smile had faltered, the sparkle in her eyes dimmed. She looked away quickly, pretending to be interested in the pattern on the carpet. It was subtle, but to me it spoke volumes. She wasn't just embarrassed for me. She was hurt, maybe even a little lost in how to support me without making things worse. The cousin's smirk grew wider, sensing the shift in power, but the room no longer fed her energy. Instead, the atmosphere felt brittle, fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter everything. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing the isolation I tried so hard to keep hidden. Then, I noticed someone across the room, my younger brother, had stopped laughing altogether. He was frozen in his chair, eyes fixed on the floor, shoulders slumped. The easy, light-hearted energy he'd had earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier. He wasn't participating anymore. He had retreated completely from the moment. That realization hit me harder than the cousin's words ever could. In that instant, I understood this wasn't just about me. It had changed the entire room, shifted the fragile balance we'd all been maintaining. The laughter had died too fast, and in its wake, something else had taken root. A silence so loud it made me want to disappear even more. The room seemed to shrink around me, the weight of his silence pressing down harder than any spoken word. He sat back in his chair, his posture rigid but calm, eyes fixed on me with a steadiness that unspooled every nerve in my body. He hadn't said a thing all day, not a word, not a sigh, but now his gaze was locked in, unblinking, as if he were trying to see something beneath my skin, deep in the parts one wasn't ready to show. I shifted on the couch, feeling the prick of heat rise in my neck. His stare wasn't angry or disappointed. It was something else, quiet, deliberate, like a slow burn that refused to flare but wouldn't die out either. The room's chatter had dimmed to a low murmur, the familiar sounds of my family fading until all I could hear was the soft scrape of his breath and the distant ticking of the clock. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging longer than the last. He didn't blink. I swallowed hard, searching for any hint in his expression. But his face was an unreadable mask. No twitch of the lips, no crease around the eyes, nothing to betray what he thought or felt. It was as if he had folded all his reactions inward and locked them away, leaving only that piercing, unwavering eye contact. The air between us thickened, charged with expectation. I wanted to speak, to fill the silence, but my voice caught somewhere in my chest. The rest of the room seemed to sense it too. My cousin, usually so loud, suddenly quiet, avoided looking our way. The others pretended to busy themselves, but their glances flickered toward us, curiosity and unease mingling in the air. The moment stretched, a taut wire pulled tight, ready to snap. Then, without moving his head or breaking his gaze, he leaned forward slightly. His fingers pressed together on the table, steady and controlled, the only motion he allowed himself. The silence snapped just long enough for him to breathe out, slow and deliberate, before he spoke. His voice was low, measured, an authority that needed no volume to command attention. "Why are you really here?" The question landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through the room and freezing everyone's breath. It wasn't the kind of question anyone outside this house should ask. Not this early, not this direct, not this personal. It felt invasive, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't yet decided to open. His eyes never wavered. The unspoken weight behind those words pressed on me, demanding an answer I wasn't sure I was ready to give. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about where I was, it was about whether I belonged at all. There's a door in the far corner of the basement that no one ever talks about. It's just there, unassuming, plain, but always locked tight. I'm the only one who knows the exact sound of its click, the way it resists before finally giving way. It's become a part of my daily rhythm, this secret boundary I cross without question, like a silent agreement between me and the walls of this house. Nobody else needs to know what's beyond it. Nobody asks, and maybe that's for the best. The house itself feels like a quiet maze of rules and locked places. Doors that open into rooms everyone shares, and others that close off like they hold something better left untouched. This hidden space isn't just physical. It's a symbol of all the parts of me that don't fit neatly into the life I'm supposed to be living here. Every evening, after the house has settled and the usual noise fades, I slip down the stairs, the floorboards creaking ever so slightly beneath my feet. The air changes near that door, thicker, heavier, like it's holding its breath along with me. It's where the ordinary world ends and the quiet, hidden one begins. Routine is the only thing that keeps this secret from unraveling. I've learned to time my movements just right, to keep my presence as invisible as possible. The house functions on a rhythm of its own, and I've adapted to it, folding myself into the spaces where I can exist without drawing attention. There's an odd kind of freedom in that, but it's paired with a loneliness that runs deep. When you hide parts of yourself, especially in the place you should feel safest, it's easy to start believing those parts don't belong anywhere at all. I wonder sometimes if my family senses this, if they notice the small cracks that form around the edges of my silence. But no one ever asks, and I don't offer. It's a mutual understanding, unspoken but clear. The hidden room, the locked door. It's a metaphor for the distance that's grown between us. I'm here under the same roof, but in a different world altogether. It's not just the physical space that separates me from them. It's the layers of secrecy and unshared fears that build invisible walls, thicker than any wood or metal. If you've ever kept a part of your life, a piece of yourself, tucked away from your family or friends, I'd like to know. Sometimes the weight of that kind of silence feels heavier than the secret itself. Feel free to comment below if you relate. That quiet isolation isn't easy to carry alone. Sharing even a little might make the burden lighter. The hardest part isn't the waiting or the fear of being found out. It's the moment when you realize that someone else has already seen through your carefully constructed walls. My father, he noticed, not with words, but with a look sharp, knowing, like he could read the locked door in my gaze without ever needing to open it. It wasn't an accusation or a disappointment. It was recognition, the kind that cuts deeper than questions ever could. And in that moment, I knew the secret wasn't mine alone anymore. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with a tension neither of them tried to dispel. Their eyes met. No grand gesture, no dramatic flaring of nostrils or clenched fists. Just a quiet, unyielding meeting of gazes that spoke volumes beneath the silence. The father's eyes, steady and unflinching, held something that the son had never seen before. A mixture of understanding and a quiet authority that didn't need to be shouted. It was as if, in that instant, the balance between them shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably. The son's breath caught, subtle but undeniable. A flicker of vulnerability passed over his features, barely masked by the habitual mask of guardedness he wore so well. His body stiffened, a faint tremor running through his fingers resting on his lap. He had been so sure, so accustomed to controlling the narrative in his own mind, yet now the control slipped through his fingers like sand. The father's gaze didn't demand explanation, nor did it offer comfort. Instead, it held a mirror up to the son's own facade, reflecting back the cracks and fissures he'd worked so hard to conceal. Around them, the cousin's posture shifted. The earlier bravado drained from his stance, replaced by a subtle retreat. No words came from him. His lips pressed into a thin line, eyes flickering away as if the invisible weight between father and son was something he couldn't bear to confront. The room's atmosphere shifted with that silent withdrawal, as if the cousin sensed the unspoken understanding that rendered his challenge moot. His retreat was not marked by defeat, but by a quiet acknowledgement that he was no longer part of this exchange. The father's lips parted just once, a faint exhale escaping, but no sound followed. It was a breath that seemed to steady him, as if preparing to untangle the tangle of unspoken truths hanging in the room. His eyes never left his son's, conveying a depth of care and complexity that words alone could never capture. The son's shoulders dropped fractionally, a subtle release of tension that did not erase the discomfort, but acknowledged its presence. It was a moment of exposure neither had sought, yet neither could deny. As the silence stretched, the father shifted his weight, the faint rustle of his sleeve breaking the stillness. His gaze swept the room briefly, encompassing the watching relatives and the cousin now seated quietly. His earlier challenge dissolved into the background. The father's expression grew resolute, a new weight settling in his posture. He straightened, his voice on the edge of emergence, ready to bridge the chasm that had opened between assumption and truth. With a deliberate pause, the father opened his mouth, poised to speak not just to his son, but to everyone present. The moment hung suspended, charged with the promise of revelation, the anticipation of words that would unsettle the fragile calm. The son met his father's eyes once more, a silent plea and acknowledgement passing between them. The father's voice, when it finally came, would carry the gravity of all that had been left unspoken until now. The room fell into a tense stillness as the father's eyes scanned each face, lingering just long enough to unsettle the unspoken, before his voice finally emerged, quiet, steady, but edged with an unmistakable firmness. "You should apologize," he said, not looking at his son alone, but addressing the entire family. The words seemed simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. His son blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "Apologize? For what?" he asked, voice tentative. The father's gaze didn't waver. "Not for the joke," he said slowly, as if measuring each word, "but for the ignorance it revealed." A murmur passed through the room, low and uneasy, as everyone exchanged uncertain glances. The mother's brow furrowed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The siblings shifted uncomfortably in their seats, none of them sure what to make of the father's demand. Even the youngest, usually quick to smile or laugh, looked down at her feet, sensing the weight of something they couldn't yet name. The son's eyes darted back to his father. "I don't understand," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "What ignorance? I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" The father interrupted gently, his tone calm but unmistakably serious. "That's the problem. You didn't mean to, yet you did. You spoke without knowing, without understanding. And that matters." The son swallowed hard, embarrassment creeping up his neck and coloring his cheeks. He glanced at his mother, who gave a small, uncertain nod, as if encouraging him to comply. The siblings looked on, caught between sympathy and curiosity, their expressions a mixture of bewilderment and awkwardness. Slowly, reluctantly, the son exhaled and met his father's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words heavy on his tongue, awkward and tentative. "I apologize for my ignorance." The father nodded once, sharply, as though that alone was not enough but was at least a necessary step. "Good," he said simply. But the room did not relax. The apology, instead of soothing the tension, seemed to draw it tighter. The mother's lips pressed into a thin line. The siblings exchanged glances that held questions without answers, and the son's apology hung in the air, fragile and insufficient. No one spoke for a long moment. The silence grew thick, layered with unspoken doubts and questions. The father's eyes remained steady, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in them, something that neither the son nor the rest of the family could quite grasp. Finally, the mother broke the quiet, her voice gentle but uncertain. "Maybe we need to talk more about this," she said, glancing between father and son, as if seeking a bridge over the widening gap. But the father shook his head slowly. "Not now," he replied. "Not until the apology means something more than words." The son looked down again, the embarrassment deepening. He wanted to ask why, to understand what had gone wrong, but the words caught in his throat. The apology, meant to mend, only seemed to widen the distance between them. It did not bring relief or clarity. Instead, it left the family suspended in confusion, the quiet in the room louder than any voice could be. The apology didn't make things better, it made them worse. He didn't need me to say a thing. It wasn't coincidence or some lucky guess that made him see through the silence, through the careful walls I tried to build around myself. What he noticed was the way I moved when I thought no one was watching, the subtle hesitation in my steps, the way my eyes flickered to empty corners like I was searching for something unseen. He saw the cracks in my routine, the little evasions I couldn't quite hide, the way I avoided certain topics or changed the subject before things got too close. None of it was accidental. It was all part of a pattern that, once recognized, became impossible to ignore. I remember the way he watched me over dinner, not pressing, not asking, but simply observing. He didn't need to hear the truth. He already knew it was there, shadowing every word I didn't say. His eyes were patient but sharp, like a man who had spent years reading between the lines, piecing together fragments others missed. It was the kind of understanding that comes from lived experience, not textbooks or theories. He had learned where to look, how to listen, and when to wait. There was a rhythm to my avoidance, how I would glance at my phone just to avoid eye contact, how I'd suddenly become busy with chores the moment he came near, how the silence between us stretched longer each time I tried to push away the weight pressing on my chest. He noticed the tension in my shoulders, the way I flinched at certain words, the brief flashes of fear that I tried to mask with forced smiles. These weren't the actions of someone merely hiding a secret. They were the clues of someone trapped in a web of their own making, struggling but unable to break free. More than behavior, it was the structure of our days that told him something was off. He saw how I rearranged my schedule to avoid certain places, how I kept my phone on silent, how I locked doors behind me with more care than usual. It wasn't about secrecy as much as it was about control, trying to maintain some semblance of order in a chaos I couldn't fully explain. He recognized this because he had been there before, had learned that when someone builds walls like that, it's not to keep others out, but to keep themselves together. He didn't confront me directly about what he knew. Instead, he let the silence speak in a way that was heavier than any accusation. His presence in the room was a reminder that nothing stays hidden forever, no matter how carefully you try to bury it. The realization hit me slowly, like a tide pulling back, exposing the shoreline I thought was safe. My home, my sanctuary, wasn't as hidden as I believed. It was fragile, porous, vulnerable to the quiet truths that live beneath the surface. And in that moment, I wondered if secrecy ever truly works. If hiding behind silence, avoidance, and carefully staged routines only delays the inevitable. Because some things have a way of revealing themselves, not through words, but through the patterns we can't help but create. Maybe the real question isn't how to keep secrets, but how to live with the knowledge that someone might already see through them, waiting patiently for the moment we're ready to speak. After that day, the house changed in ways no one dared to name. The laughter that once filled the rooms grew quieter, shrinking to a fragile whisper, barely audible beneath the weight of unspoken truths. Conversations that once wandered freely now halted abruptly at the edges of the secret no one would address. The air thickened with a tension that neither time nor distance could dissolve. The cousin, once so vibrant and teasing, became a shadow in the corners of family gatherings. Their eyes avoided mine, flickering away like a candle guttering against a draft. No longer did they smile with the warmth of shared memories. Instead, there was a coldness, a careful detachment, as if the invisible line between us had been redrawn and I stood on the wrong side. Their silence was louder than any accusation, a quiet judgment that settled deep beneath the skin. And I, too, found myself retreating into a shell carved from the same silence. Words, once so easy, now tangled in my throat, choking on the weight of what had been seen, what had been understood without utterance. The family gathered, yet felt fractured, as though we were all actors in a play where the script had been torn and reassembled in a language none of us fully understood. The spaces between us stretched, filled with the echoes of what was never said, the conversations swallowed whole by an invisible void. Dinner tables became battlegrounds of avoidance, eyes fixed on plates, forks tracing patterns in food, voices lowered to murmurs that skirted around the truth. Celebrations lost their warmth, replaced by rituals performed out of obligation, hollow and mechanical. Even the walls seemed to absorb the silence, holding it like a secret of their own, pressing it back onto us with an unyielding weight. Each room whispered memories that no one dared to revisit, as if the house itself had grown wary of the story it now contained. No one mentioned it again. It was as if the secret had become a ghost, haunting the edges of every interaction, a presence felt but never named. The cousins' avoidance wasn't just physical. It was a withdrawal that fractured the invisible threads that once bound us. I could feel their gaze, not meeting mine, but always close enough to remind me that the past was a living thing, reshaping the present with silent force. And in that silence, something else settled, a lingering discomfort that no amount of time could erase. It wasn't just the secret itself, but the way it reshaped how we saw each other, how it fractured trust and rewove the fabric of family into something fragile and uneven. It was a quiet unraveling, a slow erosion of the bonds we had taken for granted, replaced by cautious glances and conversations that never truly began. Some secrets do not fade. They cling, persistent as shadows at dusk, reshaping the way we move through the rooms we once called home. They change how we see the faces we once knew intimately, altering the landscape of memory and expectation forever. And once noticed, they linger, not in words, but in the spaces between them, in the silence that refuses to be broken. If you believe some secrets change a family forever, not because they are spoken, but because they are finally seen, subscribe and share your thoughts below. Because some things, once known, can never be unseen, and the silence that follows is the heaviest truth of all.